to ask questions at anything. Perfect. So who am I? My name's Mike Fitzpatrick. I have 35 years experience in radio. I started as a 15-year-old. For 25 years, I worked at a network in Australia called Triple M, Australia's legendary and iconic rock, sport and comedy brand. And for the last 11 years, I ran that network as head of content. I programmed across 44 radio stations, built music formats, built sport formats, transitioned Triple M from a linear broadcaster to a digital powerhouse, and now I am, my friends call me a C-word. We're consultant. I'm sure they use the other one as well. I also work with radio networks across the world, digital audio companies, and I manage both and work with both independent and network podcasters, talent, including one of Australia's largest podcasts, Alpha Blokes, and I'll tell you about them shortly. This is kind of strange. We're walking around in a circle, so if I get sick and fall over, you'll know why. I thought today we'd look at the opportunities that exist for radio and podcasting to learn from each other based on my experience of working across both. Now, the name of the session is everything, right? That's when Anders said to me, what can you do? I came up with the name first. Like all good radio people, I started with a name and then thought, now I've got to work backwards and put some substance to it. So the idea of Cain and Abel being warring siblings, let's forget about the fact that one killed the other one, but they're warring siblings. And radio and podcasting to me are often like warring siblings. Radio often worries about being upstaged by its little brother. When podcasting first arrived on our doorstep, radio, and still to this day, looks at podcasting and goes, that's nice, that's cute, isn't that cute? You're doing audio. Amazing. You know, we've been doing audio for years. Let us worry about audio. We'll have that space. And podcasting, ever the younger sibling, has all the answers and doesn't ever listen to the older one. And I think the opportunity exists for them to work together. Podcast audiences are growing fast, both radio listeners and listening continues to increase year on year, so they're both powerhouses. Larger networks have seen the digital future and invested in their own tech, or licensed an existing platform and a brand and distributing their own content, paying through the nose for new talent to create original podcasts for them, researching, producing, PR plans, marketing, distribution. Many radio stations around the world are still holding off or not interested in on-demand audio. Some rolling their eyes at a platform where the barrier to entry is a phone and a 4G connection. But digital transformation, as we know, is critical to both survival and growth. The latest Edison Share of Ear report from the US shows that audio consumption is at an all-time high. So if you're in radio, why would you not embrace podcasting? We shouldn't still be having this conversation. It doesn't have to be expensive, but I don't have a platform, and I have clients who don't have platforms. But tech shouldn't be a barrier to creating great content. You don't know how to sell digital. Well, there are podcast companies that you can work with, like Acast, who know how to sell podcasts. They've been doing it since 2014, and they also have tech. New talent, very expensive, but the talent you need are most likely already in your company. And podcasters, the barrier to entry is so low that podcasting has a long tail problem. Now, the Chartmetric Spotify study from 2021 demonstrated that, that 100 million song jukebox that is Spotify, 90% of its listening came from 1% of its titles. And podcasting is no different. In fact, I think it's probably worse. There are, and I'll get the numbers wrong, but Cridlin has them. He has all the numbers. something like 64 million podcasts in the world, 330 million podcast episodes, and I would suggest that 90% of podcast listening probably comes from something like 0.1% of titles, because there's Joe Rogan, Call Her Daddy, and then Daylight. And guess what? Discoverability is a real issue for podcasters, especially with that long tail problem. But radio has scale to help podcasters with discoverability. The best way to promote a piece of content is in another piece of content. Radio has hours to spare. You can't tell me that every radio station around the world has 24 hours of programming where they are guaranteed a win every time. And if someone was to come to you and say, we've got really great engaging content that we'd love to put on your radio station because it helps with discoverability for our content, and it helps you create content in your schedule, that we shouldn't be looking at that as an opportunity. I'm interested if anyone in the room has actually partnered with another company to program podcasts on terrestrial broadcast signals. Is anyone doing that? See, you are? You are. Does it work for you? No. Okay, maybe we should take that one out. It's an idea worth exploring. But the bottom line here is, no matter how much is spent on developing platforms or how much scale you have, no one is going to listen to bad content on great tech. Now, radio and podcasting do so many things so well, and it's good for one to look to the other to see how the content can be improved. So I'll run through some ideas, and they're just ideas, things I've observed in my work. I have a few points for radio. Radio should be hiring creators, not presenters. Radio needs to work on building community, not just talking to community. Radio needs to be experimenting more with digital audio. And podcasters, for God's sake, edit. Learn how to edit. Lean into local. There's a real opportunity for local podcasting. And create noise, because radio's been doing that for years. So let's go back to the first one. Radio has a talent problem. Certainly in Australia, we're losing talent to podcasting. Now, I have radio presenters come to me probably weekly at the moment saying they'd like to make a podcast. Can I help them? And my first question is generally, well, you've got a podcast arm in your network. What are they saying? Have you pitched it to them? 9 times out of 10, they'll have said, yeah, I have, and they're not interested. They don't want my podcast. Is it more than an idea? Have you created audio? Yep, I've created 3 episodes. They don't want it. They can't sell it. They're not interested in taking it. Which is, that's strange. The talent's good enough to be on the air, but they're not good enough to create content for you on demand. What the best radio shows and podcasts do, in my opinion, is the person behind the microphone is the person who's going to listen. So if someone has a passion, if someone needs a microphone and has a story to tell, it's crazy that we don't embrace that, because they will go and make it somewhere else. And radio shouldn't be losing its own talent to go and create a podcast at a different company. Now, this happens in Australia. I see podcasters creating content with other companies, but I also see podcasters creating podcasts or content with the listener as their first consideration, because really, for them, it's a small business. There's no middleman. They're doing this directly with the people they're talking to. Now, I work with a podcast in Australia. The name of the show is Alpha Blokes. It's an amazing story. These two men are coal miners from central Queensland. They're not influencers. They didn't know how to edit video. They've never recorded a piece of audio in their life. And they created what is now one of Australia's biggest podcasts within 12 months. It went from no listeners to being in the top 5, especially with 18 to 34-year-old men. And they did it by thinking about the audience that was going to be receiving the content and what they were doing, how they were going to use the podcast. And they thought about it like that because they are their own listeners. It makes more sense if you hear it from Tom. Anders, could you please?
G'day, it's Tommy here from Alpha Blokes podcast. Would have been probably a year and a half or probably more ago now, me and a mate sat down and we're actually at a fire having a beer, and that's where normally all the best ideas come out. You just don't normally act on it, and we decided to that day because we were talking about podcasts and how they really help us when we were driving out of the mines, having to drive out 4 or 5 hours just to go to work, and then when you get there, often you're sitting in a truck or a machine or something like that where there's nothing to do but just drive. So we found podcasts to be an unreal tool to help us either learn something or have a laugh or get out of our own head, because you just overthink when you're stuck in a position like that, away from your family, staying at camp for long periods of time. And we decided to give it a go because we thought we could make each other laugh, and we're like, we can relate to these people. There wasn't much out there. So quickly thought about it and realised that the people who can listen to podcasts are people that are sitting there in a truck all day, that have nothing better to do, or in those sort of situations. So, and truck drivers on the highway and stuff like that. Anyone who has the time where they can be sitting at work with, earbuds in or the radio on, they can consume podcasts. So relating to those people was easy for us, and they're the people who can consume the product that we're offering. And it turns out that a shitload of people we're related to, and that's where everything sort of took off. I think that's the important thing, is giving these people an opportunity to listen to someone that they can relate to, which takes them away from the maybe 12 hours at a time where they're stuck in a machine with their own thoughts. That was basically the idea behind it, and I think we're starting to make some movements and some headway with people talking about, head noise and mental health and stuff like that in the industry, and it's been an unreal experience.
That's amazing. So this guy's a coal miner, remember? He's not before that ever made any content, but he's now a creator, and one of the smartest creators I've ever met. He has this innate sense of his audience and this innate sense of content. And by the way, he doesn't normally talk that slow. Tom's wife just had twins 2 days before. They've come home and now he has 4 children under 5. That's how we all feel with one. So podcasts are made by creators, and more often than not, radio shows, I feel, are presented. They're not the same. Certainly in my experience, one, a creator is firmly in control and has their hands on the show. The other is led by a programmer or a producer. We shouldn't be walking into rooms still in 2023 with talent sitting in I don't know if you still have whiteboards, a talent sitting in a room with a whiteboard and waiting for the programmer or the producer to say, well, this is what we're going to do on the show tomorrow. Here's the guests. How are we going to attack this? That should be the person whose name is on the show. They're the creator. They need to touch social. They need to know what edits have been made. They need to know how the show is going to run. They shouldn't be being told how the show is going to run. Now, these presenters that come to me that want to make content, these radio presenters want to feel valued. When we talk about where we find the talent to make podcasts or the cost of talent to make podcasts, they're probably already in your business and often being overlooked. Tony and Ryan, I'm not sure if you've heard of Tony and Ryan, they are ex-radio in Australia. She was an audio producer and Ryan was a jock, very good at back announcing Dua Lipa. But he also wanted more. They both wanted a podcast. They're now signed to to Spotify as a Spotify exclusive in Australia, and they're one of Spotify's biggest exclusive podcasts. And I spoke to them about this idea of hiring creators and not presenters and feeling valued. Top left, please, Anders.
The word creator as well. You're like, well, you don't present a YouTube channel, you create a YouTube channel, and if you want a show, create it. Often it comes from desperation or rejection. It doesn't always come from a good place, but it's just, if that's what you want to do, then do it. Most of the stuff I've done, I've pitched to my employer, they've said no, and then I've done it myself. Tony asked for a show for years. They said no, and then we started this one, and you should have heard them begging for us to stay.
But well, you wouldn't be interested in staying, would you? And I was like, well, like you knew what I wanted, you knew what I was here for, and I was just cutting audio, and they went, oh, that fat girl in the back, she can't do, like, don't give her a show, like, it doesn't matter, like, whatever. And then I was like, okay, well, now I'm the fat girl at the front, so.
And they really do. They make 5 podcasts a week. They're half an hour's long, and they're one of the biggest in Australia. 2 talent that were in radio that have now left radio to make podcasting because they weren't given the opportunity. Now, we've all had talent that we've lost from under our noses. I'll put my hand up and say I've said no to people that I thought weren't right for the radio station, and they've gone elsewhere. Look, one of them happens to be Christian O'Connell. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Christian O'Connell. Christian did breakfast on Absolute Radio in the UK. In fact, I met Christian at Radiodays in Amsterdam. It would have been 4 years ago. And I hold the dubious honour of having a whole chapter in his book written about me because he thought I was a bit of a prick, really. We met at Radio Days. He was keen to move to Australia. He thought I was going to offer him a job. He said, I want to do breakfast radio in Melbourne. And I laughed at him and said, have you tried New Zealand? That's a little bit like someone saying, I want to work in London in radio and saying, have you thought about the Isle of Man? So he didn't really think I was that great a person. But Christian now, and we get on very well now, but Christian is a creator. He runs his show. All of it. He touches everything. And he's number 1 now in Melbourne, against my better judgment. He is the number 1 breakfast show in Melbourne. He does an amazing job. And last week I threw him this idea that radio should focus on creators, not presenters, when we look for talent.
Talking to people I've known in radio all over the world, I don't think radio does have a very good track record in finding, nurturing, and developing. The relationships I've had with the best people I've worked with, it is about you're in it together. You're co-creating something. They give you ownership. And also, for me, the best relations I've had in the last 10 or 15 years of radio are with radio stations and management there that understand that I have other things that I'd like to do, and they will say, how can we support that? So over the years, that for me has been writing books, doing stand-up, doing podcasts, other projects. Then you're in this relationship which has a narrow bandwidth. Is about we're only interested in you 6 till 9. It's like, what else are you up to that actually we can help you with? How can we support each other along the way? The more that your talents and creators are encouraged, they're going to see the relationship as not being transactional. I've had to look outside to develop my skills, going back to stand-up, writing books, doing podcasts. That's made me a better presenter. How can you do that for other presenters? I think that's a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, and Christian is a great example of what I'm talking about. He wanted to do more than his radio show. And when he went to his company, ARN, in Australia, they grabbed it with both hands, and he created his Stuff of Legends podcast for the iHeart platform. I asked him why he wanted to create a podcast as well as a radio show, and why didn't he just do what he was doing in the podcast on the show itself?
So for me, it was about how can I stretch what I'm doing. I've cut back in the last 7 years. I hardly do any interviews on the breakfast show now because I realised they weren't what the audience wanted. The guests are all doing the rounds. They're not giving the audience or me anything new or original. They're in plugging mode, so they don't really want to go anywhere other than just saying how great the movie is, how much fun they had making it. So I cut back on them and haven't looked back really. However, I do miss interviewing people, and I wanted to find a way where I could have a deeper conversation that had a kind of format that moved the conversation on. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I think they're running now about an average runtime of 18 hours, I think, for some Joe Rogan episodes. I still wanted to have a longer form conversation, but bring a radio kind of pace to it as well, without being quite as pacey as a breakfast show. So for me, after so long in radio, I'm constantly looking for ways to reinvent myself, stretch, evolve. I still see myself as serving an apprenticeship.
Well, he's quite a master for someone serving an apprenticeship, and the second season of his podcast launches in a few weeks' time. Now, the other thing that podcasters are great at, that I think radio can absolutely improve, is building community. Now, this is not my quote. I wish it was. I can't attribute it to anyone specifically, but I can't claim it as my own. We're not in the entertainment business. We're in the community building business. Radio helps people feel connected to their local community, but podcasters build community. merch. I know it's really simple, and I've opened LinkedIn this morning and saw Fred Jacobs had written a blog about this. None of you going to think I've flogged it from him. But the idea that, radio stations give away T-shirts, and you never see anyone wearing them. Certainly in Australia, we don't see people wearing radio station T-shirts at barbecues. But if you go to a barbie and you see someone wearing a Joe Rogan cap, 3 other guys who listen to Joe Rogan will come up and talk about that show. They've built a community of listeners who feel connected to each other. Events for their listeners, one-on-one discussions, exclusive content. Podcasters are just better at this because there's no middleman. And I really don't know any radio talent that take it upon themselves to go out and build a community of their listeners. It kind of feels a little bit like, well, they're listening to us, and why wouldn't they? But podcasters are grateful for, and they look at those analytics. Every listener they get, they go, we've got another listener. Hey, we've got one in Doha. We've got one in Dublin. We've got 7 in Birmingham. And they can count them. I think that helps build that sense of community. But radio can absolutely move to this, and it doesn't have to be difficult. Tony and Ryan again involve their listeners every day in their show, and it's not a let's get calls on the air kind of environment. I mean, they do a radio show podcast, in inverted commas, but it really, when I spoke to them and asked them how they build community, it starts with something so simple that anyone can do it.
We reply to all the messages in Patreon. We reply to as many as we can, comments and Instagram, DMs. You think, every time we reply, that's a 5-year core memory that they're going to have for ages. They're going to tell their friends about it. And for what costs us 5 seconds is going to make someone's day. And we can do that, sit down for an hour and do it 100 times. Mm-hmm. It's so incredibly powerful. And I don't know a breakfast radio talent that replies to comments. And you go, we really care about the audience. Did you spend a minute replying? No. Well, do you care? And even if you do it for the wrong reasons, it's great for business.
Yeah.
Do it for the wrong reasons.
There are so many people that have asked us the same question you just asked us. Like, how do you build that community? And it's just like making any relationship, like it's effort. And people go, if you've got a great community, you must have an awesome iPhone. Like, how do you reply to comments? Or your podcast is so good. Yeah, what's the trick? What microphone do you use? Your podcast is so successful. But it's not about any of that stuff. You could reply on an old PC. Like, it doesn't matter how you do it as long as you do it. And I think people just enjoy the genuine nature of that, like, one-on-one connection of us replying to their message or liking something, and it costs nothing, but it makes so much impact. And It is just that. It's just like putting time into any relationship.
Really, really simple. Like, so simple. When I was at Southern Cross Stereo, we had Hamish and Andy for many years, who I'm sure you've heard of. Probably the last big, massive Australian show. They were the biggest media in the country at one stage, if not still. And they used to, maybe this is not unusual, but they used to answer their own phones. Even when they were, a 25 share in afternoon drive, they'd answer their own phones. They wouldn't let the producers do that. So you're a listener, you're ringing the radio station, and one of the biggest stars in Australian radio picks the phone up to talk to you. That's really powerful. Now, radio can also be experimenting more. I love this idea because when I was programming and running Triple M, I like to break things, even if they were working. Breaking things was fun for me, and so I broke a show. We had a sports show that had lived at 6 p.m. for many years, and we moved it to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's not the part that broke it. The challenge was we had to move it back to 6 p.m. And we spent 2 years building an audience at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I didn't want to run the show twice. I didn't want to run it at 2 o'clock and then at 6 o'clock. So we created Australia's first pre-broadcast podcast. And it was the first time we really thought about putting podcast first and capitalising on 2 audiences. The show is called The Rush Hour. It's still on air now. And we would record the show in the afternoon for the podcast environment. So it sounded like a podcast, not a radio show. There's no imaging in it. It wasn't big at attention grabbing. It was more conversational. We would record that and we'd push it out at 2 o'clock. On the air, we would promote. The guys would go on air at 2 o'clock and say, hey, we normally hear at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Guess what? We're now on podcast. If you want us, you're driving home, you're a tradie knocking off work, why don't you grab the podcast now? And then for the rest of the afternoon, for the audience, the part of the radio audience that was never going to consume a podcast, we'd just say, hey, catch the rush hour tonight from 6. Two things happened. The audience for the show at 6 p.m. grew, and the podcast became the biggest radio show podcast, second biggest radio show podcast in Australia that year. Because we were driving people to listen to the content for the first time. We hadn't really we promoted podcasts, but we hadn't changed their habits and sent them there. That podcast, by the way, after it was recorded, the guys would record some fresh links, a couple of pieces of new content, and we'd play it out at 6 o'clock at night. So it would be similar, but not exactly the same show. Radio catch-up is another way we can experiment. I wrote an article on LinkedIn on this recently, and I was later misrepresented in an article on a radio trade website in Australia that suggested radio podcasts are dead, and radio podcasts are not dead. We're talking specifically about catch-up here, right? Now, I personally have an issue with catch-up because I think if one of radio's great unique selling propositions is that it's live, then why do I want to catch up on it? My other big issue with catch-up radio is generally it's no more than a scoped air check, cut together and then published. Certainly in the States, I hear some awful catch-up podcasts, back announcers, phone solicits, intros of songs. Like when we were jocks, when I was a jock, you would never send a content director a scoped air check that sounded that bad. You would have at least crafted it a little bit to make yourself sound better, to sound like your presentation style had been crafted and that you cared about what you did. But these radio catch-ups are being pushed out and we're attaching our brands to them and we're letting our listeners consume them, and they're having an awful, awful interaction with our brand as a result of some of these. At their best, however, they can be amazing. It's not hard to take the 5 best bits from your morning show when they get off air and sit down in the studio and record fresh links and stop thinking about it as a broadcast and think about it as a narrowcast. How can we bring or build that community and bring them into this show that we wouldn't on the air? How can we take them behind the scenes? Now, Marty Sheargold is a successful broadcaster in Australia of 20 years experience. Marty and I worked together back 20 years ago at Triple M, and then I brought him back to Triple M it was COVID too, so 2021, to create his current breakfast show in Melbourne. The show started during COVID, so there was no one in cars. Really hard to build a breakfast show when there's no one in a car listening to it on the way to work. So we really focused on podcast for discoverability. We didn't just want to push out a catch-up podcast, so Marty came up with the idea of creating fresh content for it each day. It started off as 5 minutes recording. Now, if you listen to that podcast, and it is one of the 3 or 4 biggest catch-up podcasts in Australia, the first half an hour is all fresh content. And it's all about a club. You feel like you're a part of a club. I caught up with Marty last week and asked him how he differentiated his catch-up podcast from all the rest of the podcasts out there. Oh, Anders, I'm sorry. Hang on, let's try again. Is that not going to work? Let's try one more.
Great question, Fitz, and always lovely to talk to you, you beautiful man. Mate, we like to make it a unique experience for the listeners, and often we'll be addressing them directly through our Instagram page, and we have a line where they can contact the show. So we're trying to include them as individuals and their thoughts and feelings around the show. So that's all part of that catch-up idea. You're catching up and you're feeling as though you're part of the club. I've always been an old-school radio guy, but I could see, particularly at the company we're at now, SCA, I can see the money that they're spending and the time that they're putting into the listener side of their business, which is all podcasting. So, I mean, you'd have to be an idiot to not understand the future of what we're doing.
Yeah, Trust Marty. Marty always tells it like it is. When he refers to listener there, by the way, he doesn't mean listeners. He means the listener platform, which is the name of SCA's podcast and audio on demand platform. But he takes listeners behind the scenes because they want behind the scenes. They want to be part of that club. They don't want the broadcast, because if you're building a community, they want to feel like they're involved in something that no one else is. You know, it was a few years ago, a friend of mine was working with Ryan Seacrest, little anecdote, working with Ryan Seacrest at the Emmys, and he was doing video interviews on the red carpet with George Clooney and Julia Roberts and all the big stars, and they were cutting them up and pushing out on social. They weren't really doing big numbers. They're doing okay numbers for Ryan, but the clip that blew up and went viral and was on every news site and got hundreds of millions of views was a 42-second video of Ryan doing a tour of the celebrity Portaloos. Because they wanted that backstage stuff. They didn't want the stuff that everyone gets. Take us in and tell us something that no one else can see. So there's just a couple of examples of radio experimenting, and there's, they're just two I could think of that I was involved in. I'm sure there are so many more. Now, podcasters, you're not getting off here scot-free either, because there's so much you can learn from radio. I've mentioned it before, editing. Christian reflected on the fact that some Joe Rogan episodes go for what feels like 18 hours. He's Joe Rogan. If he wants to go for 18 hours, that's fine. But when you're a new podcaster, and remember the average podcast gets around 200 listens, you are just screaming for some discoverability. How do I get people to trial and stay? So having a 2-hour podcast about the history of buttons is probably not the solution to growing your audience, because nothing in the world was ever made better by being longer. I may live to regret that, but I certainly believe if you have a 2-hour podcast and you're told to take the 30 weakest minutes out of it, it's only going to improve the content. I'm not the only person who thinks so. My friends Tony and Ryan, remember Spotify, Australia's one of their biggest exclusive podcasts, X Radio. They also have a theory about this, Anders.
Just because you can talk for 3 hours doesn't mean that you should, and doesn't mean it's going to be a good 3 hours. And I don't think that it'd be good if we talked for 3 hours either.
So we've actually had this thing, and then we're still talking about it, is that we were getting concerned that the podcast, we were trying to make it shorter. And then we always have this conversation in the office, like, oh, that's not long enough. And we keep going, oh, it's not long enough. And then by default, it goes a little bit longer. So we're always in this balance of how can we shorten it up but still leave enough personality in there. Yep. It's like the quality of the content plus the humanity of reacting and what's natural conversation.
Yeah. Because you can't, if you lose that magic, then it could just be any two people talking.
For 3 minutes.
Then you might as well read an article. Like, why would you put AirPods in if you're going to just hear something that could be written by AI?
Yeah. The other thing I'd love to see podcasters do, I'd love to see, because, niche is, podcasting is such a beautiful space for specific topics, as we know. Niche is great. But I'd love to see them lean into local. Especially, radio has always done this so well. They talk to community. They create local content. Local radio stations, local hosts, local content. Local can be niche, and I'd love to see, certainly I know in Australia, SCA doing this, they're creating local podcasts now, they've got a huge regional network. But I'd love to see individual podcast creators do this as well, because in my romantic view of the world, someone's going to be sitting there in their bedroom in 10 years' time as, the know-all, knows everything that's happening in town. The biggest name in town is the person who hosts this local podcast. They see everything that's going on. They talk to everyone that knows everything. They're in the know, and they connect people together. So I think there's a real opportunity for podcasts to get local at a very hyper-local level. And the third thing, because I'm rapidly running out of time, is create noise. Now, radio has been brilliant at this for years. We know how to create noise. We're broadcast. We've got, so many other signals and brands to compete with. Well, now we've also got YouTube and Patreon and podcasts and, you name it. Everything else coming at us. So many choices for content. We've had to get great at making noise. Podcasters can absolutely start thinking beyond just talking into the microphone. How do we create PR? How do we get discovered by creating opportunities for us to be talked about by other people? Remember, word of mouth is still the strongest marketing tool there is. Recommendations from other people. I'll use this example, but to finish up on, Tony and Ryan, again, bringing their radio sensibilities to podcast, know had this idea just at the start of the year. Does everyone, you have charity bins here where you clean out your wardrobes and you've got all the clothes that don't fit anymore and you take them to charity? Or if you like, certainly in Australia, what happens is you clean out your wardrobe and instead of taking them to charity, they sit in your back seat for about 12 months. And then they get moved to the trunk and then they go to the back seat. You're driving around thinking, I must take those to the charity at some stage, or one of those big metal bins. And Tony and Ryan knew their listeners because this came from a call from a listener. How do I get rid of, I can't find a charity bin where I live. How do I find a charity bin to get rid of my clothes? And they hit on this idea. They were going to get a bus and they were going to go to not just major cities, but regional centres around Australia as well. And they'd be there on certain days and you could come down and get a photo with the guys and hand them over the clothes from your back seat and just put them on the bus and they'd take them to charity. Really simple idea. Spotify, I believe, paid for them to theme the bus, so there's a massive billboard on the side. But that wasn't the thing that got them PR. The thing that got them PR was that there were hundreds of people lining up to get photos and drop off their clothes. They created a PR stunt by accident, simply by trying to help out their community, which I think is such a beautiful and simplistic way of creating a wonderful promotion. It's got to be organic because you can't fake authenticity, right? And those PRable moments, those stunts, if you want to call them stunts, it's a horrible word, but they come from the most authentic moments of content. And I guess that's one of our strengths as radio people and programmers is that we're trained to look for those moments and make those moments big. And I'd love to see podcasters, more of them, take that opportunity to do that as well. So there you go. Radio, I'd love to see partner with podcast companies for distribution and sales, hire creators, not presenters, build community, and experiment. And for podcasters, look to radio for discoverability. Partner with a radio network. You can work together. Edit your content, lean into local, and learn how to create some noise for discoverability. Well, I've talked for 40 minutes and I don't think I took a breath. It's really hot in here. Is there any questions? Oh, one. Yes, brilliant.
G'day, I'm Gary from New Zealand.
Oh, I didn't mean the New Zealand comment.
No, yes. Hi, I'm Gary from New Zealand. I know the chances were small of a Kiwi being in the front row, so I understand. I get it.
Aotearoa is one of the most beautiful countries in the world, by the way.
I got two questions, actually.
Yeah.
Firstly, you're talking about community building, and I would have thought a lot of that is to do with the fact that the podcaster usually owns the podcast. Like on a radio station, you have a show, but you don't own the show. And the podcasters, like Joe Rogan talks about it, he'd never give up the rights to the podcast. So how does SCA and Listener deal with that, like who owns the podcast when you have new podcasts on?
Well, I'll point out that I'm not at SCA anymore.
Oh, sorry.
But that's okay. Look, I think it's a matter of reframing how the radio companies look at their podcasts, look at their shows. Sorry, I just saw the CEO of SCA walk in as I mentioned SCA, so I better be careful. Really, for the opportunity for shows to operate like small businesses, that's what podcasters do. They operate small businesses. It's direct to consumer. But there's nothing stopping a morning show host or an afternoon drive show host taking some ownership of building their own community. Don't wait for a programmer to give you the approval to do it. Don't wait for the promotions team to go, we've got no budget for you to go out and have drinks with your listeners. All these podcasters go, we're going to turn up at this pub at this time. We're not shouting you drinks. We're not buying them for you. We'll just be there. If you want to come down and have a chat, we're there. That's really powerful because then you're not just the person in the ivory tower, the untouchable. You're a real, authentic human. So I don't think ownership of the content, like actual ownership of the content, really has anything to do with your inability to be able to build community.
Yeah, cool. And my other question was, I agree with you that there's a lack of radio talent coming through, and they'll move to podcasts, or influencers will start podcasts, so they've got built-in fan bases already, so that's successful. Is there any examples of podcasters being recruited to come over to radio and how that's gone, or?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, we do. We no matter which company it is, we see great talent and we recognise great talent and we'd love to have them in radio. The challenge is if you've got a successful podcast, well, let's talk about successful podcasts first. A day planning, a day getting content for your show, a day recording. You're working 3 days a week. and you're not getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning or working at 10 o'clock at night on a Sunday, right? So this idea that you're either a podcaster going to do radio or you're a radio presenter going to do podcasts, I think if we look at it all as you are a creator, and whether you back announce Hotel California for a living and want to create a content about the history of buttons on the side, or you want to be, and I have this as well, I have people coming, I want to be in radio, but there aren't the opportunities for me beyond the back announcing of Hotel California or the back announcing of Dua Lipa, or hooking what's coming up in 15 minutes and here's the secret sound, be caller 10, you could win $50,000 but you probably won't, right? That's not, if you're a creative person, that's a real challenge. So this is why I think a lot of radio companies have the opportunity to, yes, hire presenters to do amazing jobs on broadcast radio, but then give those ones that need a microphone, those creators that have a purpose, that want to create content with a purpose, give them the opportunity to create it, because Acast do it, they give them the tools and they publish it themselves. Someone doesn't need, they will, I can tell you 20 radio people that will sit in a studio, they'll research it, they'll record it, they'll source their own interviews, they'll edit it and give them the tools, they'll publish it themselves. And they're not expecting massive amounts of money from it. If you're selling it programmatically anyway, sure, give them a clip on the way through. But that's a bigger question around how you remunerate talent, I guess. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm really sorry about the New Zealand thing. Christian would have been great on New Zealand radio. Any further questions? Yes, hello.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle. I'm CEO of Beat in Ireland.
Yes.
Just to mention the question you asked, then actually in Ireland, 2 podcasters were recruited and are now on the Drive Time show on the national state broadcaster in Ireland, which is interesting. We haven't got the Jane Law results yet, so jury's out to see how it goes for them.
Actually, to answer both, to comment on that and answer that question, Abby Chatfield has one of the biggest podcasts in Australia, and SCA grabbed Abby from Podcast Land and created a night show for her as well. So it does happen.
My question is, our breakfast show had tried lots of podcasts, and the one that's been most successful for them is they now produce content that's adult-only content on the podcast that they can't get to do on a family-friendly breakfast show.
Brilliant.
So my question to you is, have you any examples of a multi-platform brand that promotes what they're doing on the radio very well on their podcast? I'm not sure I'm getting the most out of what they're doing on podcast to advertise it to the podcasters that are listening to this adult-only content, to drive them back to radio.
All right, so they're coming in to sample the adult-only content on the podcast,
Yes.
but you're not necessarily driving that audience back to terrestrial radio.
Perhaps they are, but I think there's an opportunity for us to definitely do more.
Well, as I said before, the best way to promote a piece of content is in a piece of content. I'd imagine you're cutting up elements of it and playing it on the air. Are you taking
absolutely,
some of the audio that's too blue to play and maybe bleeping it?
Yeah, we have to. Yeah, pretty much.
What did
all
she
done.
say next? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Look, there's in the big Venn diagram of traditional heavy radio listeners and heavy podcast listeners, there's that little bit in the middle where people will consume both. And the challenge, I think, will be that if you've found a podcast audience, they're probably heavy podcast listeners and aren't choosing traditional commercial radio. But do you need them to? Because they're still touching the brand, and you're still able to go to an advertiser and say, you can buy this brand, you can buy these talent, and you can buy them across both platforms, or you can just buy this one. Do you really need to drive them back to radio?
That's true, but it always helps.
It does, well, yes. It does.
It's called Daily Dilemma Uncensored, if you'd like to check it out.
I'd love to. Thank you. Any further questions? I know we're out of time. Hey, thank you so much for having me here. This is such a beautiful city. And I'd also love to thank Anders, and I want to thank Camille, because if you're like me, you ask Camille lots of stupid questions on email for the last 2 months, and she's a treasure. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, and come back for the final presentation in track 2 at 1:45 about increase of news engagement.